Assalamu alaikum, friends of BookBytes. Yesterday, the 3rd of May, we commemorated World Radio Day, both on Salam Media and throughout the industry globally. But we also have to pay attention and take cognizance of the fact that there are journalists being killed. There's a war against journalists, against journalism, and against the truth at a time when we feel that we live in a time of free speech, freedom of speech and truth-telling, and there's more than ever the need for truth-telling. So let's bear that in mind as we also speak to our next guest this evening about my radio memory, listening to the listener, which is really a historical commemorative journal, really, edited by Robin Sewlal. It says here, this centennial book is dedicated to every South African who has enjoyed the beauty and charm of radio through the decades and who has in turn ensured its longevity and perennial power for it to continue providing information, education, entertainment, and much, much more. And today our guest is Robin Sewlal. Advocate Robin Sewlal is the chairperson of Radiocracy, which is really a movement. He serves as an advisor, consultant, editor, strategist, and trainer for various entities. Robin has been active in the radio fraternity for many a decade, perfectly positioned to be at the helm of this wonderful sort of documentation. He helped establish Oddworks Music Radio while studying at UDW and then joined Dome Music Radio at University of Natal. Robin was involved in special event stations Beachwise 103 FM and Light FM. He hosted Capital Beat on Capital Radio. He founded and chaired the DJ Association, was vice chairperson of the Music Association of Natal, and served for many years as commissioner at the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Post-democracy, Robin was a judge for the Radio Arts Awards at the South African Broadcasting Corporation, judge at the Sanlam Media Development and Diversity Agency Community Broadcast Media Awards, and adjudicator for the Liberty Radio Awards. He serves as a judge for the Vodacom Journalist of the Year and the United Kingdom Community Radio Awards. He's edited several books, including Reflections of the South African Media, 1994 to 2019, which is a brilliant archival history, and it is a tribute to the legendary Nelson Mandela. And today we'll be talking specifically about my radio memory, listening to the listener, and it's got this fantastic, a compilation of some of the media personalities over the years, different forms of media. And so without much further ado, Robin, welcome to the show. Welcome to BookBytes. It's a wonderful opportunity to have this chance to chat to you about your Radiocracy movement. Welcome to BookBytes.
Thank you, Shafinaaz. Salam, and it's really good to be here on BookBytes. And thank you for the intro. I was wondering whether you were talking about myself or somebody else for a moment.
Well, I think it was absolutely necessary because on the one hand, you've got this extensive historical documentation in my radio memory, but we also needed to situate how exactly you're positioned to be the perfect person to have brought this compilation together. So chat to us right from the start on where this project, started, how it came about, what was the process like for you?
Well, just to start off, thanks for that question. Just to start off, it has really been a fascinating journey. You think you know people, you think you know everything about radio, but we're learning every day. And for me, that is what I marveled at, and that's what fascinated me through the years. In 2022, when I discovered that next year radio is going to be 100 in South Africa, I thought, well, I've got to do something. I've had the love, the intellectual curiosity, the passion for radio from the time I was a little boy. And I said, I can't let this momentous occasion pass by without me contributing in some shape or form. And I decided, because I'm a firm believer, there's a complementary relationship between the various media platforms. I decided, why not a book about radio? And so I decided to give the listener an opportunity. And many people asked me over the years, why the listener? And I say to them in simple language, if there's no listener, there's no you, there's no me, and there's no radio station. And so for me, the listener is key. And so I dedicated the first book, which I've got out at the moment, to the listener, hence the title, My Radio Memory, Listening to the Listener. I use my friends and my colleagues and my network of contact in the media industry, sent out a media release and throughout the country. And as it turned out, as you can see in the book, I got contributions from around South Africa, from all walks of life across the various spectrums. And that pleased me no end. And so that's how the book came about. And as you would notice, apart from the listeners, I added a bit more interesting and exciting stuff, which we can talk about in a few minutes.
So what's really interesting for me is, look, people have been very enthusiastic about contributing to this compilation. And it seems to have brought up a lot of nostalgia, a lot of memory. People have found entertainment and education through the art form of the radio, and how radio has evolved over time is also documented here through those memories. Because look, I mean, right now, we're on an audiovisual program having this radio sort of connection. Whereas, radio, where it started and what it meant to people in different forms and ways also comes through in these nostalgic memories that are documented here. Let's talk about how you approached people and what they felt. Maybe give us one or two examples of the contributions within listening to the listener.
Well, if you look at the first chapter, he was my vice chancellor at one stage at the Durban University of Technology, and I'm talking about Professor Amit Bawa. He's the first chapter in the book, and I say that because I went alphabetically, so that's why he was first. But a fascinating story, and may I add, the contributors to the book didn't know who the other contributors were. And nobody knew that David Gresham was writing my foreword for the book. And as you would notice with Amit's contribution, he talks about building a radio when he was ill in bed, built a radio, and the first station he listened to was LM radio back in the day. And the first voice that he heard was David Gresham. And so for me, it's amazing how these little stories come together, the so-called sum of the parts. And it interests one no end. And like I said, you wouldn't see David Gresham's name throughout the book because people remember him from hosting the Top 20 on Springbok Radio, initially on a Friday evening and then on a Saturday afternoon. And David was a real star. I mean, he was very, very supportive. Even up to this day, David has said to me, Robin, you need any assistance from me, I'm here for you. So, that's one good story that I liked. But, what was nice about the stories, everybody added a new dimension. Even if they spoke about David Gresham, they brought up a new angle in the story. Whether it was Capital Radio, whether it was Springbok Radio, whether it was 702, or the then Radio Bob, Radio Truro, Peace Radio, Radio Freedom, Springbok Radio, when it was still going on, and I got Lynn Mansfield to write a reflective piece on Springbok Radio. Everybody had something interesting to say. And that's where you and I learn from these stories of listeners. As I often say, everybody has a tale to tell. And that was the opportunity I gave them from a radio perspective.
So the other day on Facebook, I noticed you commemorated the 75 years since Springbok Radio had been inaugurated. Let's talk about that historical kind of station and how content might have evolved over time, because I imagine it would have had to. How long did Springbok Radio have its tenure, and did content evolve to suit changing political dimensions and ideologies over time?
Springbok Radio is a very interesting, if I may put it this way, a case study. As you know, it was controlled by an apartheid government. It was state-run, not a public broadcaster in the true sense of the word. Notwithstanding, Springbok Radio was really, like I said in my Facebook message, theater of the mind medium. It was news, it was current affairs, it was shows, programs, bringing back what I call painting pictures in the listener's mind, and that's the imagination that listeners actually go through. Sport, entertainment, and wonderful personalities. In a sense, Springbok Radio would have continued even up to this day if it wasn't for television. When television was introduced, the numbers of Springbok Radio lowered, and the powers that were at that stage decided that there was no future for Springbok Radio. And in the mid-70s, Springbok Radio came to an end, abruptly, may I add. And it's very, very sad because people still hark back to the days when Springbok Radio was on air. It was really theater of the mind stuff.
That's quite interesting because I know my parents talk about listening to certain radio programs, series that they followed on the radio. And you're saying now with the advent of television in the 70s, you have this people sort of probably audiences moving across into this new thing that's about available in South Africa, and a changing dimension, and then pulling away from something like Springbok Radio, which would have had a loyal audience at the time over that period that it operated. So tell us a little bit more about this so-called changing technology, because obviously we've seen a lot more in the last 20 years as well. Talk to us about that initial changeover and what it meant for radio across the board.
Well, I may add that I think the powers that were at that stage were too hasty in closing Springbok Radio. Television in this country was a novelty. Incidentally, television celebrates 50 years next year. On the 5th of January next year, it's 50 years for television. I would imagine that if the powers that were stood with Springbok Radio would have been top of the pops as we speak. It did not run its full course. We did not see the full potential of Springbok Radio because of the dramas, because of the short stories, because of the plays, the book reviews, and the kind of information and the education that it gave. Yes, it was apartheid, a relic of apartheid, but it really did matter to the listener. Bearing in mind, Springbok Radio, in a manner of speaking, had no competition. There was no competition when Springbok Radio came about. Notwithstanding that, the programs like 10 o'clock tales and squad cars and the whole range of other programs, test the team in the quiz shows, etc., were really gripping stuff, and it really appealed and attracted the listener. And so technology, in a sense, was a novelty when we come to television, but it did not dim the power, the appeal, the attraction, and really what radio gives you. Radio gives you that connection. Radio gives you companionship. Radio is intimate. And radio reaches where television will probably not reach in decades to come. And so the reach of radio is very awesome. It's powerful. And that's where the listener around the country enjoys radio, because radio is the medium where people get the first taste of the news and current affairs every morning when they get up. And that's why radio plays such a powerful role. Radio is portable. You can listen to radio at home. You jump in your car to work. You listen to radio. You're on the beach. You listen to radio. Now that radio is available on different devices, you can pick it up anywhere. In a sense, radio is ubiquitous.
That's an interesting commentary, because now, even though they had decided to shut down at that time in the 70s your Springbok Radio for the sake of television, all these years later, we're seeing a whole new revival and a reliance on radio still, despite so many new technologies and apps and a range of media forms of media transmission, which speaks to the resilience and the nature of how radio is transferred. So when we talk about My Radio Memory, talk to us also about this broader project, and give us really an understanding of why and how this is such an important documentation for our time, for all time, to be able to capture what and where the history of radio in South Africa through the imagination of the listener, and what this means in your ongoing projects.
Well, Shafinaaz, that's a very interesting question. When I decided to do the book, I said, let me do the book to celebrate radio. um, because radio, every South African citizen has grew up listening to radio at some time or the other in their lives. There's no doubt about that. In as much as I put the book together, the book does not belong to me, so to speak. It belongs to every South African. That is why I want to make the book as accessible and available as possible. Because at the end of the day, it's the listener, it's the South African citizen that makes radio what it is. Yes, radio has survived, as you just mentioned. It's not only survived television, it's survived just about every other competing device that you can get. Whether it was a PS3, PS4, PS5, it's probably going to get PS6 one of these days. But the point of the matter, radio is triumphed and trumped all those devices. May I also add, when we talk about devices and platforms like Spotify and Apple, etc., those are not competing devices. Those actually complement the radio output, where radio is available on those platforms. And so intelligent, proactive, creative programmers and station managers should see that as complementing the radio output, but not competing with radio output, the radio stations, the radio platform that we have. So radio, if I may add, has a long way to go to survive and thrive. As you're probably aware, radio commands a listenership of 34.9 million listeners every day in South Africa. And that is quite a tall order, more than our population in this country. And it is growing. We have 3 tiers of broadcasting, commercial radio, the public service broadcaster, as well as community radio. And the numbers are increasing. And may I add as well, the radio played such a powerful role during the pandemic. And the numbers increased dramatically during that period because it was a familiar voice. It was somebody that they could trust. They can get the information. They can be educated. You can pray listening to radio. You can educate yourself listening to radio. And you just, there was no kind of drive time or breakfast show in the morning because we were not going to work. And so people who are creative use radio to their best advantage. And that really increased the numbers of listeners tenfold, I may add.
I have to say, BookBytes was born during the start of the pandemic. So I definitely hear what you have to say in terms of opportunities for content creation, but also that idea of connectivity. Radio has shown itself, proven itself to be the force of connectivity. I didn't know the exact numbers, but to hear, 34 million plus is incredible just for South Africa alone, because it means that if we really want to reach audiences, radio is still the way to go. It doesn't have to have a visual element. It just has to have this broad-based kind of connectivity and access through various devices. And like you said, the complementary stations, the complementary sort of platforms such as Spotify and that sort of thing. So I think that radio has shown itself not just to be resilient, but to be able to adapt with new forms of technology and availability in various ways. And it's just fascinating to be able to have a document like yours, to be able to go back and just see what the history has been like. Let's talk about some of the stations, right? I came across comment on Radio Truro, Radio, how, that's evolved now, Radio Lotus, 702, Classic FM, and some of the ones that even I don't recognize. Talk to us about some of the golden old stations, what might have happened to them, and some of the new sort of, radio stations that have come about over time, and the ones that have really stood the test of time, so to speak.
Well, the radio station that you're referring to forms part of 12 stations that were on air in South Africa that are no more on air. You mentioned some of the names like Radio Truro. But what was interesting that I managed to track down people who are directly involved with these radio stations. As you would see, Zakia Ahmed Siddiqui wrote on Radio Truro. She was very young back then, got involved in Radio Truro. And she mentioned some of the stalwarts in the past, Sanibai Budram, Ghulam Marjam, Julie Ali, Zubi Mayat, T.P. Naidu, Ketan Lakhani, Safi Siddiqui, the late Safi Siddiqui. And that for me was very interesting because we grew up listening to those kind of people. who've moved on to other radio stations where Truro was closed. So, and if you read carefully with the Radio Truro story, those programs were recorded in South Africa and they were transported to Swaziland where the transmitter was put up. And it was rebroadcast, or should I say broadcast from Swaziland back into South Africa. Very innovative, very interesting. The Easy Kirschers of the world had actually formed. It formed part of the Swazi Music Radio Consortium. And apart from Radio Truro, there was also a station called Radio Phoenix in Durban. It was a community radio station. Unfortunately, it had to close prematurely because of some difficulties it experienced with the regulator. And I got Roshan Maraj to write that piece on Radio Phoenix. Interestingly enough, if you read Zakia's piece, Roshan actually trained at Radio Truro, and then he joined Radio Phoenix. So it was that kind of complementary relationship, you will. You mentioned Classic FM. Lyndon Johnson writes about Classic FM. Martin Bailey writes about Peace Radio. And Peace Radio came about during the phase of the democratic and the freedom era in our country. Came about in 1994. It joined forces with the SABC for a short while, and then it ran for a good year and a bit, and it closed somewhere in 1995. I was very pleased and proud to have Stan Katz write the piece on Swazi Music Radio. And Stan Katz actually was the person who pioneered talk radio in South Africa on 702. Swazi Music Radio morphed into 702. And 702 started as a music radio station in 1980. And they felt that we need to get South Africa talking. It was the height of apartheid in South Africa, and people had to get a lot of stuff off the chest, so to speak. And so it was Stan Katz who did his homework, did the research. Stan had a lot of experience back in the USA, and he was the guy who pioneered talk radio in South Africa. And talk radio has, and as you know, 702 is a story on its own, another case study, if I may add. And like I mentioned earlier, Lynn Mansfield wrote about Springbok Radio. Lumko Mtinde wrote about Radio Freedom, which was broadcast from outside the country into South Africa. And very, very interesting story, And Radio Freedom, when it kind of closed, a lot of the staff from Radio Freedom kind of got back into South Africa. They were in exile, and when they got back into the country, they transferred their skills to individuals and to organizations in our country. So that's the long and short of that chapter. So yeah, very interesting. It's actually has got a lot of people talking about the stories that they read about the stations that run air. Some of us, or some of the readers, should I say, didn't hear about these radio stations. But may I also add, one of the other intentions of this book is to remind the youth of today what the senior people in this country experienced from radio through the years in South Africa, what radio was all about. And that's what radio gave us. Radio gave us that companionship. Radio is a very personal medium. You could be alone, but with radio, you're never lonely. And that's the personal relationship. You could be alone in your room, but you'll never be lonely because radio gives you that kind of companionship. It's intimate. It talks to you. It's a personal medium in a sense.
So radio really is that it stood the test as a companion of many ways, and allows people to maybe join the conversation. I'm really fascinated when you talk about 702 engaging talk radio back in the 80s. What kind of censorship would they have been faced with? I mean, I think it's fascinating that they even engaged, the platform for that reason, understanding that people would want to speak. And subsequently, in the 90s, there must have been an absolute thirst then to create more content and the possibility for more conversation. So what would have happened to radio around that time? You can speak to us about some of the censorship challenges and the post-90s era of maybe a re-emergence of radio.
Well, the long and short of your question is that 702 saw a gap in the marketplace. Its transmitters were not in South Africa. So there was a technical, so to speak, getaway. In other words, the transmitter was in Botswana. Like Capital Radio had its transmitter in Transkei. And when Capital Radio started broadcasting in 1979, its news and current affairs program told it like it should be told. And that's where people, through the struggle, were listening to Capital Radio to get the latest news, what was happening in our country. Prior to Capital Radio coming on air, I, for example, relied on the overseas stations, like the BBC World Service, the Christian Science Monitor, Radio Netherlands, Deutsche Welle, the Voice of Germany, and all these, Radio Canada International. But when we got Capital Radio in Transkei, they had correspondents in the country, in South Africa, telling us like it should be told. And that's where 702 found the need to engage in talk radio, because they had the transmitters in Botswana, which means that the South African government technically could not touch them.
That's incredible. I mean, subversive media from within the 80s, at a time when the state was so volatile, and having these conversations happen on the ground is absolutely fascinating, and speaks to the power of radio back then and now as well. And there would have been an impetus for more content in the 90s. Was there a station called Radio Bop?
Radio Bop did come along. There's also a chapter I should have added. There's also a chapter on Radio Bop by Albie Modise. Yes, Radio Bop came around, and there was Bop Television. It was very interesting personalities. Many of the Radio Bop presenters were poached by then was known as Radio Metro, which is now known as Metro FM. So yeah, I mean, the likes of bless his soul, Bob Mabena, who cut his teeth on Radio Bop. The likes of Shada Twala, Sandile and Zalo, they were on Radio Bop, and they moved across to the SABC. Radio Bop was one of the stations that, provided, music and entertainment where you could not get in South Africa, or should I say South African stations.
This is an absolutely fascinating discussion, Robin. Thank you so much for your time. I know we could continue literally for 5 hours. I know that you're still continuing to have these conversations and launches around the country for My Radio Memory. Recently, I saw an ad for the upcoming Pietermaritzburg launch, and a Durban launch next month as well. So we look forward to hearing how this ongoing conversation gets more people thinking and remembering the beauty and the history of radio. We wish you everything of the best.
Well, thank you, Shafinaaz. If I may mention, I'm doing the Alan Paton Literary Festival in Pietermaritzburg on the 23rd, 24th of May. I then do a launch in Maritzburg, like you mentioned, and I'm very happy to say our former Minister of Communications, Yunus Karim, is my guest speaker there. He was quite thrilled to be invited and to cooperate. And then the following week, I'm in KwaDukuza on the KwaZulu-Natal North Coast, where I launched my book there. And then I'm at Ike's Bookstore in June. And thereafter, I'm in Johannesburg. So, I'll keep you posted on what's really happening. I'm at Exclusive Books in Rosebank in June, and other places as well. So, yeah, very interesting journey.
Please do keep us posted, because I'm quite sure there'll be lots of our audiences and readers who would want to attend and add to the conversations that you've generated through this, because radio has such amazing nostalgia, and we all take ownership for these conversations. I also want to commemorate, you did mention Auntie Julie Ali in your sort of commemorative line about the veterans, and Auntie Julie presents a show on Salam Media, a regular show on Salam Media. So it was just beautiful to hear that mentioned as well. With that, we wish you everything of the best, and we'll definitely be joining you on your tour around the country.
Thank you, Shafinaaz, and thank you to BookBytes as well as Salam Media. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thanks very much.
Absolute delight for us as well. And so there you heard it from Advocate Robin Sewlal about My Radio Memory, listening to the listener. And we would love to hear some of your nostalgic stories about radio, your experiences and your love for radio through the ages. Please do share the comments on this post. And that's it from us this evening on BookBytes with Salam Media. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.